Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 7, Cognition, Part 3A, Retrieving Memories. And I'm going to tell you right now, this third part here, it's going to be in basically 3 parts. So follow along, and then we're going to have some other ones that are going to kind of continue here. So how do we retrieve memories? Well, whether memories are implicit or explicit, successful retrieval depends on how they were encoded and how they're cued. So memories can be successfully encoded with or without any of our own awareness. The big thing to remember here is when we talk about implicit and explicit memories, what that actually refers to. And anytime we are purposely or consciously trying to remember something, that is called an explicit memory or explicit, means that we're purposely trying hard to do this. This would be like trying to remember things for a test, perhaps. An implicit memory or implicit form of long-term memory is something that we're not fully aware that we're doing, meaning that it's an unconscious thing. So if you've ever been, listening to the radio and then hours later, that song that you kind of found kind of annoying comes back to haunt you because it keeps playing in your mind, that's an implicit memory. So implicit, explicit memory. HM, if you remember when we talked about him a while back, has retained the ability to learn motor skills, meaning that he can has a memory for that, but not necessarily a memory for things that happened, as far as like what he ate or what he did during the day. His procedural memory for such motor tasks is really normal. Even though he can't remember learning these skills, he doesn't know that he knows how to perform them. So the idea of like zipping a coat or being able to tie his shoes, he can learn those things, but he doesn't realize that he, consciously was trying to do that at some point in time. So over 100 years, psychologists have realized that people with no memory defects can know something without knowing that they know it, which sounds kind of weird. The psychologist Daniel Schechter, he calls this implicit memory. And this is the memory that can affect your behavior, but which you did not really deliberately try to learn or which you currently have any awareness of. By contrast, your explicit memories involve your awareness. You are purposely giving attention to the things that you're trying to recall. So implicit memory, these memories are not limited to procedural memories, nor is explicit memory synonymous with a declarative memory. So explicit memory, this is such as remembering material you have studied for a test. Implicit, such as knowing the color of your building in which you're taking your psych class. So retrieval cues. For accurate retrieval, both implicit and explicit memory require good cues, and things work much the same way in long-term memory, where successive search requires good material or mental retrieval clues, which are kind of search terms used to activate a memory. So you might recall, an event that happened years past just because of the smell of a cookie. That might maybe cue your memory of a birthday or a holiday. Emotion also works as a retrieval cue. So if you were feeling like you were angry at the time that this memory was kind of being encoded, when you're angry, you might be able to retrieve that memory. So retrieving implicit memories by something called priming. There was a former Beatle, his name was George Harrison. He got sued when he wrote a song called My Sweet Lord. And the deal here is that when you hear the melody of the song, it sounds like it's almost identical to a group named the Chiffons, their song called He Is So Fine, or He's So Fine. Anyway, Harrison borrowing was a product of subconscious memory, meaning that he probably had heard that He's So Fine on the radio at some point in time, kind of liked the melody, maybe it kind of got embedded in there. And when he picked up the guitar and started strumming, My sweet Lord, for some reason, it sounds almost identical to He's so fine. So it's like you have proposed an idea to a friend and had it rejected, but weeks later, your friend excitedly proposed the same idea to you as if it were entirely new. This is what we call a prime implicit memory. Okay, so priming is a technique for cueing implicit memories by providing cues to stimulate a memory without our awareness, because of the connections between the cue and the retrieved memory. So in a way, you could kind of plant the idea in someone and use priming to kind of pull that out. It's kind of tricky, but it does work. Okay, so we're going to do a little priming here. We're going to take a look at these words here. Okay, take a moment to look at them. And what we're going to do maybe an hour later is come back to those words. You would be able to easily identify the ones that you had seen before. Okay, so an hour later, you would also have a much easier time filling in the blanks of some of the words. And so we take a look at these blanks here. Maybe you might identify something from what we previously looked at. And then I show you some of these items. So while you did not actively try to remember octopus and climate, you were primed in the reading, which made it easier for you to identify this task. So, retrieving implicit memories. Anything stored in long-term memory can be filed according to its pattern or its meaning, and consequently, the best way to add material to long-term memory is associating it while it's in working memory or your short-term memory with material that is already in the long-term memory. So, if you can bridge that over, that makes it a little bit easier. We call this process elaborate rehearsal. And elaborate rehearsal gives you more ways to access memory. Meaningful organization, remembering the gist of an idea rather than the actual words heard, demonstrates the role of meaning that the role that meaning has in long-term memory. Humans' long-term memory stores meaning rather than an exact replica of the original event. So if you want to store a new memory in your long-term memory, you must make it kind of meaningful while it's in working memory, but you kind of have to make it your own. So I could give you a definition in class, but if you could put it in your own words, there's probably a better chance that you're going to be able to pull that out of long-term memory when you needed the definition. So recall and recognition. The retrieval of explicit memories can be cued a couple different ways. First involves retrieval of required items for like an essay test. That's called a recall. The other involves a method needed like a multiple choice test, and that's what we would call recognition. So recall as a retrieval method is one in which you reproduce previously presented information by creating an answer entirely from memory. So if you're studying for an essay test, you're probably going to spend a little bit more time trying to memorize certain things, whereas a recognition retrieval, one must identify presented stimulus as having been previously presented. So it's less demanding as far as the cues. And in a way, you might be able to see something that looks similar and from the gist of it actually kind of make the connections. So recognition is also the method used by the police when they ask an eyewitness to identify a suspect in a robbery with what they would call like a lineup. So you're going to look at these suspects and you're going to try to maybe point out the person who looks maybe the most familiar or similar to the one that's in your memory. Other factors affecting retrieval, things like your alertness, your stress level, drugs, general knowledge also affect retrieval. Less well known are the influences related to the context in which you encoded the memory and also the context in which you are trying to remember it or to retrieve it. Encoding specificities. These experiences are contrasting examples of encoding specific principles, that is, that it involves the situation in which the context affected the way a memory has been encoded and stored, influencing its retrieval at a later time. And general researchers have found that the more closely the retrieved cues match the form in which the information was probably coded on the cues or encoded, the better the information would be remembered. All right. Desirable difficulties into their courses. Students should be given assignments that make them come to the grips with the material in different ways. So things like projects, papers, problems, and presentations can be very helpful rather than just memorizing material. Your mood and your memory. Our moods can affect the way that we pull a memory out of our long-term memory. The episode of uncontrollable giggling, euphoric mood can trigger one silly thought after another. At the end of the mood spectrum, people who are depressed often report that all their thoughts have a melancholy aspect. This phenomenon is called mood congruent memory. And the memory process that selectively retrieves memories that match one's mood, which we kind of mentioned when we were talking about emotion and motivation back in chapter 8. Anyway, mood congruent memory can also have important health implications. Depressed people, again, are more likely to emphasize their medical symptoms. They may retrieve treatment that is much different, or receive treatment that is much different than from that is dispensed to people who are a little more upbeat with the same disease. There's also what we call the tip of the tongue or the taut phenomenon. This is the inability to recall a word while knowing that it is right there in your memory. People often describe this as a frustrating experience because the word is, for the most part, on the tip of their tongues. You know it, but you just can't pull it out of your memory. So names of personal acquaintances or famous people or familiar objects, these are the things that sometimes get kind of thrown into that tip of the tongue phenomenon. If we're stressed out, chances are it's a little harder to recall those items when we want them. But if you're relaxed, usually, a short time later, you can probably retrieve that information and you'll be saying, I knew it all along. All right, we're going to kind of move into what is called the 7 sins of memory. And we're going to start with a few of these, and then we're going to have a break in our video, and we're going to kind of come back to the rest of them. But the whole idea is, why does our memory sometimes fail us? And then a lot of this is because of these 7 sins. The whole idea of transience, absent-mindedness, blocking, misattribution, suggestibility, biasness, and persistence. Most of our memory problems arise from the memory's 7 sins, which are byproducts of otherwise adaptive features of our human memory. So transience is the fading of memories that cause forgetting. Memories seem to weaken over time, and although no one has directly observed the human memory trace fade and disappeared, much circumstantial evidence points that transience or the impermanence of long-term memory is there. And this is the first of Daniel Schachter's 7 sins of memory. Transience is the impermanence of long-term memory. It's based on the idea that long-term memory gradually fades in strength over time. So there is what we call the forgetting curve. This is a graph that is plotted out by the amount of retention and forgetting over a period of time, over a certain batch of material, such as a list of kind of nonsense words or syllables. Typically, the forgetting curve is steep at the beginning and it becomes flatter over time. And modern psychologists have built on Hermann Ebbinghaus's work, because it was Ebbinghaus who came up with this idea of the forgetting curve. But they are now more interested in how we remember meaningful material, such as information that we've read in a book. And sometimes Ebbinghaus's work, or the forgetting curve, sometimes is known as something called L to J. And I'll mention that here in just a little bit when we take a look at the graph. But some memories, however, do not follow the classical forgetting curve as closely. For example, motor skills often are retained intact for many years. So even if you haven't been on a bicycle for many years, there is still that chance that later on in life or decades later, you could get on a bike and kind of have that knowledge of balance. So this is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, or sometimes known as the L to J. So I might give you a vocab quiz, and we do this over a very intense period of time, maybe in the first day or two. And we look at like the percentage that you have right. And then, 5 days later, we give you the quiz again, 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, so on. And what usually happens is that over a period of time, if we're not pulling that out of our long-term memory, there is that tendency for it to fall back. The goal of like L to J, because what you're seeing right now is kind of the L, is to bring it back up into the J shape. And that would be maybe reintroducing some of those terms over a period of time so that you're constantly using them, and then at some point it is actually in your long-term memory. So absent-mindedness, this is the last one that we're going to mention before we break for the video here, but this is basically forgetting that is caused by lapses in attention, like I can't remember where I put my phone, or I can't remember where I put my keys. It's not that the memory has disappeared from our brain circuits. It's just that we have suffered from a retrieval failure caused by our shifting our attention elsewhere. So, you can see the lady here and not remembering where she put her glasses. Well, they're on her face, okay? Or they could be on top of your head, or wherever you left them last. All right. Thank you very much.